programs. So another 3% are in the mainstream programs at parent request. They haven't met the criteria yet. 9% of our students, about 135,000, are enrolled in the alternative programs. And other is 5%. This is self-report, so these could be very often special education settings that children are in and they didn't want to classify one way or the other. They're providing appropriate services according to their individual plan. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. That's true. That's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. And it could even vary by grade level and in your district. For example, when I was teaching, part of my teaching experience was in a middle school where I had newcomer students, and they were that number one. A lot of them were that number one group, late entrants, that had no prior schooling. I also had some of the kids that had the prior schooling, and they moved much more quickly. So what I did for them, how I organized services, was a little bit different for them because they could move on a quicker path if they had that academic background. Structured English immersion will differ by grade level, by school, by district. And that's what the Prop 227 study found as well.
Remind me on 227, I know at some grade levels, the lower grades, it was mandatory. Was it to 10 years old?
Yes,
is it
10 years and younger.
And then above 10 years old, what did 227 do?
You can get, it was just you could get a waiver option under different categories if you were over 10 years old, if you were at grade level, if you were an older child.
In so the practice in the field, is there a difference in the way that?
It's just the waiver process. Most of the alternative programs are in the elementary schools. Is that what you were asking? How they organize services, is that different according to how old kids are?
227 tried to draw a clear line between younger kids.
Yes.
In which it was felt that English immersion, would be very productive, and older kids who might need a wider variety of strategies take a little bit longer to get English fluent, and the subject material covered is important to keep up with. Whereas in the younger grades, you're pretty much learning language anyway. In practice, is that distinction about above 10 and below 10 mean anything in the field, or it's been washed over?
Really where it does make a distinction is basically in the waiver process. There's different ways to go about it, depending on your age. But students are generally, if they're at the early levels, they'll be in a structured English immersion setting. If they're at the higher levels, then they're placed in the mainstream setting. So,
I have a question. Does this Prop 227 study, since obviously the teaching, whether it's structured or the alternative programs, differ both by grade level and district by district?
Yes.
Has it done an analysis both by grade level and district by district, both within structured and alternative, about which has success and which isn't successful, so we could use some of the more successful programs perhaps as models?
What they're seeking to do in this last year, their study, and we'll be getting there in just a moment, is some more case studies and going into districts to identify the promising practices from the districts that seem to have really good test results, seem to be beating the odds with that sort of thing. They have looked at all the program models and visited those classrooms in the past, but they want to explore further this year. And I'll talk a little bit about that.
Because I know Ruth and Ray and I were chatting about this, because I think that's a very important goal for all of us, particularly since and the mixed results of the tests, one of the disappointing results obviously was in high school, was with the English language learners. So I think the more we can actually identify what's working, so that we can use that to help the groups that aren't, is going to be very important for the state.
And it is important to identify the promising practices and who yields results. What we try to get at when we're evaluating effects of any English learner program is not to get that snapshot that has all the students across the board, but rather to look at how long they've been in the program and what kind of results is it that we're seeing, because that's how we can see they have enough English then to demonstrate. Then moving along to the evaluating the effects of Prop 227, as we mentioned, the 5-year study was commissioned by the legislature, and an independent contractor is completing that work. This will begin the final and 5th year of the study. This is the year 4 report's just coming out, but these findings came out of the year 3 report, and each one of these topics could be something we go on for quite a while, but I'll just kind of go through them and see if there's any questions about those. Again, this is what the independent evaluator found, that, of course, a number of complex factors influence the implementation and impact of Prop 227. I think Superintendent O'Connell was talking about several of these things today. Standards, assessment, aligning curriculum, and getting results over time. But Prop 227 came in when class size reduction, new testing, accountability, reading improvement and issues, the new ELD standards and so forth were just coming into place. So they're acknowledging that it's a very complicated time in history when this program came along. When they went out and did their case studies, they found that programs were not generally well articulated and implemented in districts. That was not a surprise. They looked at redesignation rates or reclassification rates over a decade, and their finding was that Prop 227 did not have a significant influence, or it says no influence on redesignation. There was a blip on the screen one year, but then it kind of leveled off, and we see it vary by 1 or 2% typically every year. And that in the schools that they labeled as bilingual schools, those were schools with at least 50% of the students receiving primary language instruction. They found that those schools had the highest poverty levels around the state. So it makes it difficult to compare programs because this factor is, of course, not controlled across settings. Ray?
And if I might point out, when you look at redesignation, that is something that's not just related to one test. It has a variety of factors. So it's a complicated issue, and it doesn't surprise me that you might not see any impact on that. It has parent request, it has teacher influence, all kinds of different factors.
In addition to that, it varies at local levels as well, because there's local flexibility with that. The achievement analyses are really no surprise. It's something that we see nationally as well, is that they looked at all student groups, English only, and LEP, that's limited English proficient, the same as English learners here, and redesignated fluent English proficient students in all grades. And they said everybody made gains in reading and math, and we've been seeing that movement. We have raised the bar, now we need to close the gap. They did point out that there still remain performance gaps between English only and English learners and the reclassified students. And that's something that we all need to work towards. And
yet the last KC results we just got had RFEPs as the highest pass rate of any class, right?
That's when RFEPs are pulled out as their own group. This study combined English learners and RFEPs, but yes, so frequently we will see RFEPs outperforming.
The study you're referring to then includes students who arrived in this country this year. Okay, so then it's, of course there's a performance gap. There's always going to be.
Which is a really good point. It depends on who you're placing in these groups as well. Yep, you're right. Gains were made by students in all of the instructional models with no clear pattern favoring one model. And that goes back to Mr. Fisher's question. And this, again, is related to the protocol and the labels that were placed on these as never bilingual, transition from bilingual into an English-only school, or always had been a bilingual school. Those were the 3 kinds of models that they looked at in this one particular study.
The achievement analysis you're referring to here, that's from this legislative study?
Yes, that's specifically to this. And, well, actually, here we go. They looked at, the Stanford 9 was the only test that they had across time before and after. And as you can see, and we won't go into detail on these because all 4 slides are very similar. This one is a cohort analysis, grades 2 through 6. They did elementary and secondary, looking at Stanford 9 reading. And you can see that the top bar is your English only, and the bottom bar are your EL and RFEP combined. Again, that was an important distinction to make, that we are doing better, but we haven't closed the gap yet. You see this across secondary for reading as well.
So and this isn't, though, bilingual versus not bilingual.
No.
So how is it affecting, how is it an analysis of 227?
Well, they're looking at, as a group with English learners, are English learners doing better?
Then what?
All English learners. Again, it's that,
but
it's
better
the
than
whole
what?
group together. Better than they were doing in the past. Has Prop 227 changed the way that they're doing? Pardon me?
Where's the past? You said better than the past.
What
That's
you're
helpful.
seeing here is 1998, 99, 2000, 2001, 2002, looking at our English learners, and these are successive cohorts, so it's your 7th graders, then it's the scores of 8th graders the next year. This is all, yeah, it's all past.
I asked you Better compared to what? And you said better compared to the past.
Right.
I'm asking, what's the data on the past? Because 227
Okay.
was 1997, is that
yes.
right?
And they started the study in 1999, so they're looking at 1998
What are they comparing
data.
to?
Well, they're just comparing it they're not comparing it pre-Prop 227.
But that's what I asked you about, what's it
Okay.
compared to, and you were saying the past. So
What they're looking at is a couple of years, 98, 99, 2000, 2001 through 2002. No, it's not pre, because they didn't have the same test data prior to that.
Well, and
so how do you tell? This isn't bilingual versus non-bilingual in this data.
No.
this isn't an answer to Mr. Fisher's question about the different instructional methodologies and what we know about what performs well versus others. That was the data, because this data is not, that finding is, the bullet is not consistent with the data Gino had provided us on that about 6 months back.
Oh, yeah. Now, he's probably disaggregated and looking at the assessment data in a different way that could probably answer your question more specifically. What we're doing is just pulling up the exact reporting that came out of Prop 227, and they're looking at English learners over a series of years, and again, not before Prop 227. When I said past, I meant past from right now, since 1998. Are we closing the gap as a state?
Would you expect to close the gap? I'm just interested in that, because if I'm talking about an English learner versus English only, and I'm saying that the definition of an English learner is a child who is not English proficient and has academic deficits. That's the definition, which of course you recall is why we had so much trouble with No Child Left Behind and the use of that. So would you ever expect that line to not have a gap? It just seems by definition there is a gap.
Yeah, I think what the best thing that we could do is look at longitudinal data of students who've been in our system for a number of years, and how are they doing then compared with the English-only students. That way we could see the results of the programs that we do have when we have our longitudinal database.
With
we can do
RFEP.
that. These are, yes,
RFEP,
over
if
time.
I looked at RFEP in English only and I saw a significant gap, that would lead me to be concerned. But I'm unclear of my concern if there's a gap between English only and limited English proficient or English learner. That's what I'm having difficulty as to what the meaning of the gap is.
They're taking what they're doing, these are not even match scores. These are quasi-cohorts of students that move from grade to grade. So again, it's that whole group picture. It's not students over time that we would expect. And so perhaps a more meaningful way to do it in the future for us as a state and evaluators would be to look at students who've been here for X number of years and how are they doing in terms of what they're able to do in English.
So I think what we're objecting,
We can't do that right now.
we're objecting to is you're putting up data that shows a gap has persisted, and then saying all programs perform equally well. And that's we're not getting how you get a conclusion or support that conclusion. You know, if you wanted to show us the students, take a cohort who are in bilingual all the way through this versus students who are in English immersion, you know, you could get some data about what programs work.
Right. And we can take that to our work group that's meeting in another 2 weeks regarding the evaluation. These are two different parts of the study, which is quite comprehensive. One is presenting their quasi-cohort analysis and also the successive groups. Another piece is where they're looking at the program models and implementation of those. So,
No, go ahead, Ruth.
I was just going to say the only thing that these statistics really show us is that the gains are almost the same in both different groups. That's all you can really
But the
look
groups
at.
aren't even bilingual instruction versus
No.
not.
no, it's
Right,
the
they're-
whole
they're
group.
combination.
It is the
Yeah,
whole
so
group.
you can't tell is the bilingual, you can't tell what
All
Don
you can
asked.
tell is that
No.
the one group that you're labeling with all of the different things, and the original English speakers, which is obviously I guess the top line in this, is that they're climbing at the same rate, but you don't have any idea.
But at least they're climbing.
Yeah,
Right.
that's all.
They're
that's what I'm
climbing
saying.
and the
That's
gap
only
persists.
statistic you can pull from that.
Well, and the other important point, though, is there's a bullet on here that says gains were made by students in all instructional models with no clear pattern favoring one model. And that, unless there's other data we haven't seen, that bullet is unsubstantiated.
There is an entire report that, you know, perhaps Mr. Parrish could come and talk with you at another time, or we could provide that to you as supplemental information for you to look at. But these are excerpts from a very large report, so they're not all, these aren't the maps that were related to that specific finding. These are showing one of their findings is
Jan-
that we have raised the bar, we haven't quite closed the gap.
What I'm very interested in is, I think Reed alluded to it, is Gino's data, or I think that was, and saying what are we doing post-reform? How do we look, what do we look like here in the state? Because as we all know, we've undergone many reforms that we believe are meaningful. So where's the picture there? That's, I think, is what I'd like to see.
If you remember when we started this presentation, one of the things that we said is that there would probably be areas that you wanted more information. And so, I predicted this would be a bump in the road along the way. So, two things. One is that Jan will take back your feedback about this study that has been commissioned by the legislature and see what we can do about working on those issues in the future. But what we will also do is provide you the information that you are requesting about performance, about the three different techniques that are used for English learners, and give that to you at a later date. All right?
But we currently have it. I mean, is that something you're working on anyway, Sue?
To kind of fetch it, but we don't have it right at our fingertips right this moment.
As Mr. Fisher alluded to earlier, I think that's a seminal threshold issue here. So.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Very good. Did you want me to provide you with the whole study as well for reference?
I think it's fine to have the study available for the members. I will tell you it's quite thick, but I think even more important are the charts and the data that I was describing.
Okay.
Because what we wouldn't want to have happen, I don't think, and certainly this board would want to be careful about it, is that some of this data is not consistent, my opinion, with the data that we're reporting to the federal government with respect to the progress that our students are making on their AMAOs for English language acquisition and academic improvement. So we want to be cautious about that. So I think it would be helpful for the board, once again, to get those charts that I was mentioning that the assessment unit had put together on the progress delineated by program. So it talks about how well are the children doing in a bilingual, how well in structured English immersion. It has that data over time. So I think that would be valuable. It's actually delineated by grade level. It doesn't have it by district, but it does because it's aggregated data. But I think it would be very helpful to have a conversation. And my suggestion is that you get it in an information memorandum so you can look at it, give the board staff some feedback, and then schedule this for a conversation at your November meeting.
Okay. Well, for what it's worth, they had more of a narrowing of the gap in these charts and grades 7 through 11 in math. Okay, I'm leaving that section. But those are important issues that everybody brought up. I don't mean to dismiss those. Resources for instructing English learners. Primary language instruction. These are teachers who have bilingual certifications since, and here's where the past comes in, back to 1998. And you can see after the passage of 1988, after the passage of Prop 227, we saw a great decrease in the number of authorized teachers. These aren't just authorized teachers. Actually, these are teachers assigned to provide primary language instruction. So you can see that many of the teachers that used to be assigned to provide primary language instruction were no longer doing that. So it's we have a little bit of up and down over the years on that. We have some very good news to report in terms of the numbers of authorized teachers that provide the content instruction in English as well as English language development instruction. The numbers have risen greatly over the years, and there are substantial training efforts going around the state that have gotten teachers the authorizations to be able to do that. So a significant increase in those numbers.
And it used to be, and may still be, an LAUSD teacher could make about an extra $5,000 if they were doing primary language, had the certification, was doing primary language instruction.
There's a differential, yeah. I don't think that's there anymore. I don't know.
You don't think it's there anymore?
I don't believe it is, but I would have to check into that.
Okay, will you check into that? I bet it still is, because it's one of those things that's hard to take off the table. The question is, do CDI instruction and English immersion instruction qualify for that?
That's a local decision. That's up to local boards to decide, do we have a shortage in this area? Is there enough of a demand to provide incentives for teachers to get authorized and actually be assigned to teach these groups of students? Janine?
Joe might know the answer to that question. He was whispering.
What was the question?
The incentive money. The incentive money for primary language instruction that a specially certificated teacher would make. If they were, where it happens, if the teacher's in English immersion, do they qualify for that extra money?
I think it's only if it's the primary language support component was the huge piece of it. I know in LA Unified, if they were fully
event.
fluent in Spanish and they were using Spanish as a primary means of instruction, then they were able to qualify for that differential.
Yeah, it's probably
And it's a
limited to
district by district
Yeah.
event.
Yeah.
It's not a statewide.
And I think it likely resulted in the past there was a tremendous shortage of sufficient teachers in these areas, and now we seem to have much a better supply to assign to those classrooms and settings.
There's several school districts that have made it mandatory for their teachers to have BCLAD, CLAD, or SEDI training in order to teach core subject material.
But
Yeah,
you're using those-
but I mean, they're making it now. All their past teachers are having to go through that training rapidly, and they're removing them if they have not completed it by now.
Well, first of all, there's a state law that the children have to have a credentialed teacher to provide services if they are in a core area. And then secondly, all new teachers who are, as of, 2004, when they leave, they're
They'll be authorized when they finish their
they're
credentials.
automatically authorized
have it.
having the CLAD. So
And so what they did is they decided that to expand on that, they even had training beyond core subjects. I know like Elsinore Unified School District, all of their teachers are now being put through CLAD, BCLAD, and SEDI training for every subject area, not just core subject materials. And they actually are providing the training during the school, after school day, and paying for that training for the teachers. So, I mean, there's a lot of districts that are doing innovative things to ensure that they have that available.
And that will vary by district depending on the distribution of students across grade levels and the concentrations of English learners and so forth. So that is a local decision. I can get back to you on the LA Unified one.
Let's move forward and keep going. Is everybody all right? Let's
That
go
was an
for it.
easy one, though. I could
Be
have
here
done
for a
that.
while.
Okay. And now I'm really happy to turn this over to Tom Adams.
well, you can count your lucky stars that this wasn't just before lunch like last time.
Yeah.
Good morning. As you know, the State Board of Education, you conduct adoptions in instructional materials for grades kindergarten through grade 8. And English language development is provided primarily through the Reading Language Arts instructional materials. In all subject areas, though, when we do a criteria for instructional materials, we do ask that materials help with the instruction for English learners. And where that is often placed is in the area of universal access of criteria for instructional materials. The criteria make specific reference to English learners, and the criteria for each individual adoption contains specific language, often referring to the necessity of learning the academic language of that subject area. In 2002, the English language development was incorporated directly into the Reading Language Arts instructional materials. And English language development was included in 3 ways. We had additional ELD content in all basic programs. We requested submissions for English learner intervention programs for grades 4 through 8. And we requested submissions for primary language programs for grades K through 8. Well, I don't. Well, I like to have a little suspense in my narrative, so. I may not be an exciting storyteller, but at least my slides are. The criteria specifically reference that on the ELD component, that when dealing with basic programs, that there be a minimum of 30 to 45 additional minutes of English language development instruction daily for basic reading programs. In addition, publishers could elect to submit an intervention program targeted specifically at English learners. And finally, publishers could submit a program in a language other than English, provided those programs are comprehensive, systematic, and designed to transition students successfully to English. Now, here's the bottom line. Did we get any in that? We did get submissions in primary language programs, but we didn't get, the submission itself didn't make meet the criteria. But what we also got, though, was we did get a EL intervention program adopted. And also, when the adoption was over for reading language arts, realizing the seriousness of the situation, the need to have instructional materials to help in this area, both the two adopted basic reading programs for K-6, Open Court and Houghton Mifflin, were available and are available in Spanish language alternate formats. So in this sense, looking at this, we have in the area of reading language arts, English language development, we have placed some tools there for districts, and these are actually very valuable ones. However, we are also looking to add on to that list with the upcoming follow-up adoption in reading language arts. Okay, well, let's go down the list here. In terms of the basic reading programs, the two adopted ones for K-6 provide that additional 30 to 45 minutes. In terms of intervention programs specifically directed for English learners, yes, we do have a program in place there on the list. What we don't have is a primary language program that met the grade. So what we did is we took those adopted basic reading programs and we asked that they be translated into Spanish, and so they are available now as an alternate format. So, and one of the things that we have to realize on that alternate format is we implemented a new process here in the department. We actually took the translated materials and we actually had those translations checked by people who are literate both in Spanish and English. And so those materials are probably the best set of translated materials we've had available in our schools in a long time.
And those materials are used in the waivered classrooms.
Right.
In the bilingual classrooms. Right. So that's what. Yeah.
And just to let you know, upcoming adoptions where we are addressing the issue of English learners. In the history social science adoption in 2005, November of 2005 is when you'll be creating a new list. We are asking for materials in history social science to reinforce instruction based on English language arts content standards, notably to read, write, comprehend, and speak at academically proficient levels. And in 2006, the science criteria, which you recently adopted, Also instructs publishers to make their materials accessible to all students and specifically mentions English learners. Other states, I haven't done any comparison on what they do program to program, but I do know this, having attended the National Association of Textbook Administrators meeting this year, and it was in San Francisco, that they basically look to us. They look to see what California is doing, what Texas is doing, what Florida is doing. And informally, I've gotten reports from a former commissioner in Texas who said, you know what, California is light years ahead of the rest of the country on these issues, that we have a more synchronized, targeted program that is geared towards helping all students, and that, you know, he sees California as really just a cut above everyone else on these issues.
My favorite other state practice is, and I'm not sure if it's across Texas or if it's just mostly the big districts where everyone is required to have 2 languages to graduate. Right. So if you show up, 2 languages to graduate. So if you show up speaking Spanish, that's acknowledged and honored, and Suzanne Tashny, get busy and learn another language, whatever it is. You know,
and so in summary on instructional materials, I'd like to just point out we're making progress. We hope to have additions later with the follow-up adoption in reading language arts. Keep in mind we do have an English learner intervention program. We do have K-6 basic programs that are available in Spanish alternate format. And we hope that in the future we will have a primary language program. And now I'm delighted to introduce Deb Sigmund, who is probably the best person on explaining the complications of assessment and putting them into a manner that we can all understand.
Thank you. Thanks for having us today. My piece is going to move along rather rapidly because if you'll recall, we were here not too long ago and gave you a fairly extensive, comprehensive look at assessment in general. So I will try to move through this pretty rapidly. Just to, you know, we always want to provide context, and of course our assessment accountability system has legislative roots beginning in 1995, which was our PTIP system. For those of you who go back long enough, that was a statewide assessment system, but not comprehensive and not different districts use different tests in order to accomplish their assessments. And then in 1997, we had ELD standards and assessment. 1999 was the Public Schools Accountability Act. And then in federal legislation, 1994 ESCA, and then of course No Child Left Behind in 2001. Our assessment programs are the hallmark of our assessment programs, of course, I would say are the Standardized Testing and Reporting Program, also known as STAR. And of course, STAR has several components. The foundation of that program is the California Standards Test. The norm reference piece of that program currently is the California Achievement Test 6th edition. And then in addition to that, students whose primary language is Spanish, English learners whose primary language is Spanish, also participate in STAR by taking the Spanish Assessment of Basic Education, SABE 2. And then for those students who cannot participate with accommodations and or modifications in our CSTs, those students can participate in the program through the California Alternate Performance Assessment. Also, we have the California High School Exit Exam and the California English Language Development Test, which is a test specifically for our English learners, and then the Physical Fitness Test. English learners participate in all of these assessments. That's critically important to remember. There is no exclusion of English learners in this state. It is the expectation that when students enter, they begin participating in our assessment system. One of the ways that we maximize that participation is to provide test variations for English learners. And a test variation is a change in the test in the way it's presented or administered or how that test taker responds. It does not change the construct of the test, does not change the score of the test. So we're able to offer these variations. And of course, we encourage districts to do that because, as I said, we want to maximize participation from our English learners. This is somewhat difficult to read, but I just provided as a reference to you. This is the matrix of test variations that are available to our English learners. This came before you in July at your July board meeting. This is now posted on the website as a resource for districts. And you'll note that there are variations around response and time and translations, glossaries can also be provided to students as well for CSTs and CASES. Unlike STAR, of course, CASE does not have an opt-out provision. As you know, parents may opt out of the STAR program. That provision does not exist for CASE, so it's important that we provide all the opportunities that we can, not only for our English learners, but for our students with disabilities as well. And so again, the English learners are required to take CASE in grade 10 with all other 10th grade students. Want to make sure that they have maximum opportunity to take and pass that test. All the tests are in English, with the exception of SABE 2, which is specific. Which brings me to this slide. Current law requires that we administer a primary language test designated by this body to be given to English learners in addition to CSTs and Cat 6. And up until about a month ago, that law stated that Spanish-speaking English learners who were enrolled in California public school less than 12 months were to also be given the SABE 2. And then it was a district option for English learners enrolled 12 months or more. With the passage of Senate Bill 1448, a bill that the superintendent sponsored, authored by Senator Alpert, our STAR program was reauthorized, and there were some changes to this particular test. We were provided some funds to go forward to develop or adopt a standards-aligned primary language assessment. And as those are developed, and we'll start with grade 2, those will replace the designated achievement test. There's a...
So hold on a sec there. I can't help but editorialize for my fellow board members to express an opinion. The real cutting edge here will be on if you don't learn English, can you do well in the API? And one argument is if a student knows science really well, but knows it in another language, how can we test them in English? And then they do poorly on the test, say, and it's not demonstrating their knowledge of science. So it's a thoughtful argument. The other side is the whole goal in the system is to get them fluent in English also. And ultimately, they enter a society where they have many more options if they are in English fluency. And if you allow a Spanish language testing, schools will put less time into English instruction. And that the API is a driver of school behavior. And if the API becomes built upon Spanish language results, schools will shift incremental focus away from that. And so where we've held the line over the past 5 years is keeping the testing system in English. Yes, there's SABE 2, but it doesn't go into the API. Yes, there's CELT, but it doesn't go into the API. So the API is a driver of of desired school behavior on our part, which is our major lever. To date, we've avoided it. What we've done is what Florida did is we have, like for example, math. We have Spanish-English dictionaries. We have other resources so that students can access. We say that in English, our standard is English language art, so it doesn't make any sense to test it in Spanish. You're just not testing English grammar, English writing, English vocabulary in Spanish, so it's inherently not testable in another language. And so far, we've essentially held that line or nuanced that, but that will be the cutting edge over the next couple years in terms of battles and differing philosophies. And it's not a right or wrong, it's what you think the wise course is. And so far, we've always felt the wise course is keep the signaling system in English so that English is more aggressively taught to English learners and they're more likely to get fluent, ultimately including high school exit exam.
Well, and a point of information, and I certainly don't disagree with anything that Mr. Hastings has said, but this board did, and staff at the department did explore looking at putting the CELT results into the API. And the technical design group, Ed Hartle and others from Stanford, well-respected psychometricians across the nation told us that that was not technically sound and it would invalidate your index. So, and we can talk about that at some later date. It's very technical, but it wasn't possible to do that. So it does also go with the focus that Mr. Hastings was describing, but there are big technical issues that prevented that from happening with CELT.
And just so you know, the legislation that is pending and has also been signed does not put the Spanish assessment into API. The API continues to be around our CSTs.
It's a step. When SABE 2 was a norm reference test in NRT, and so no one even gave it plausible. To the degree that the next step is there's a Spanish language standards test. That's a building block towards that. So, it's an ongoing issue.
Just a little bit about SABE 2, which is that norm reference test. The board extended the SABE 2 for use during the spring 2005 testing. So students in grades 2 through 11 will continue, or English learners less than 12 months will continue to be given that test. Just a little bit more, again, as I said, there is this legislation that will require us to develop or adopt a standards-aligned primary language assessment in reading and math only. That would be done in the dominant primary languages determined by the language census. And as you saw with Jan's opening slides, we're at 85% Spanish. So for much of our lifetime, it will probably continue to be Spanish. So we don't anticipate that we'll be developing another primary language assessment at this time. As I said, it would replace the designated achievement test as developed. And then this is probably one of the biggest changes. Yes.
Will you go back just for a second on the SABE?
Yes.
Go over the specific content that's on SABE, because it's generally perceived to be read, use the example, science. Science isn't in that test.
No,
it's vocabulary,
yes,
spelling, reading,
and math.
And math in Spanish. So the only non-language subject is math. And the rest of it is all, can you read, write, do vocabulary in Spanish?
Correct. So this is a major change. We will be assessing students in two categories, who are either receiving instruction in their primary language, and those would be those students who are in those alternative programs, or have been enrolled in a U.S. school less than 12 months. Now that might not seem like a huge change, but it is in terms of a benefit to districts. Districts have been struggling with having to assess students who come in new to California but have been in an English-based program for quite some time, may still be an English learner, but are not literate in their primary language. So we get a number of students from Texas and other high second language states, and so districts have found that they've had to test these students, and it's been a rather not a terribly positive experience for those students who are not literate in their primary language. So we're hoping to correct some of that and to really test those students who are new to the country. Any other questions about that? No. California English Language Development Test, I think we went through this in terms of the historical context of that. I'm going to kind of slip through that. The California English Language Development Test has actually two assessment windows, if you will. There is the annual assessment window, which we are currently in right now. That began July 1st and will continue through October 31st. That assessment is for all identified English learners. So they would have had to have been identified the prior year. And then there's the initial assessments for those students who are new to the district or that school who don't have a prior CELT score. So they've not yet been classified as an English learner, but their home language survey indicates that their primary language is something other than English. And the initial assessment period is from July 1 through June 30. So two different, same test, but different purposes. And the primary purpose for the initial assessment, of course, is to identify those English learners for us so those students can begin receiving the services that they need. And then the annual assessment results help us to monitor the progress of those English learners in acquiring English language skills. I want to point out that CELT is not an academic achievement test. It is a test of language proficiency. And the other use for CELT is that it's one criterion that districts use in reclassifying students to fluent English proficient, or RFEP.
Deb, what are we seeing in terms of, Reed pointed out earlier that there is some redundancy with the English language development standards, actually a great deal in the early grades, and our California standards on the CST. So what are we seeing in terms of comparability between the CELT test results and the CSTs? Is there a high correlation?
Well, you know, we have not looked at that.
Okay.
And so what we have looked at, and I think what you were referring to in your prior conversation, was we looked at some program information for just CELT. We've looked at that. We are, based on your conversation that I just heard here, it seems that we'd be probably, it would make sense for us to look at CST scores in terms of program delivery and so forth. So we're going to do that. But I'm not aware of anything that we have done to that end. I can certainly find out.
And then is there any way you guys can get those displays that Gino did for us down here today? There's so many people in the audience who are here to see this presentation. It would be useful. That'd be great.
I actually went up and got it, and if
you'd the best.
And if you'd like, we can make copies. Is that something we should do? Okay. Okay. Reclassification has to be based on these four things: assessment of proficiency in English, which we use the CELT, teacher evaluation, parental opinion and consent, and then comparison of academic performance in basic skills. And we recommend that folks use the California Standards Test. And I'm going to give that back to Jan. Any questions?
No. Any questions? No, thanks, Deb, very much. As we move toward our break, we're going to keep hurrying along here.
Yes, we'll hurry along. This piece deals with the accountability provisions under NCLB as they relate to English learners, and we'll be able to move through it fairly quickly because I think most of you have gone through lengthier sessions on this. But NCLB looks at two kinds of results for English learners. One is that it asks the question, how are English learners achieving academically in math and English language arts? And the way that that's operationalized is in the adequate yearly progress subgroup reports. And the second that is new with this authorization of ESEA under NCLB is how well are English learners progressing in English? So this is the first time we've been able to do this. Two ways we ask that question and answer it. Are they making annual progress, and are they attaining proficiency over time? This Venn diagram just shows what many of us know, that Title I and Title III require setting standards, having assessments aligned to those standards, and annual measurable achievement objectives. But the intersection is that, once again, we go back to our dual educational goals. We want to increase language proficiency for English learners and improve their academic achievement. So it's the goals that we have one more time. And this is something Mr. Hastings was talking a little bit about as well, is that under Title I, all subgroups are responsible for making adequate yearly progress, or AYP, including English learners. Now, English learners, by definition, are not proficient in English. So what we negotiated with USDE was to be able to tell our success stories of English learners and include our reclassified students in that subgroup until they had scored proficient on the California Standards Test 3 times. And that same flexibility was later extended in part to other states by Secretary Page. And a visual for this would be our California LEP, or English learner students. They're labeled as LEP until they hit about mid-basic, so we can't report a large percent of them reaching proficient on the standards test because they're relabeled as RFEB at that point in time. So by combining these groups, we're able to show the success stories and report the number of English learners, former English learners, who are at that proficient bar. So that's how we've organized the accountability piece under adequate yearly progress for Title I. We are able to tell the success story there. And that was a very important change. Title III then requires states to establish English language proficiency standards and conduct an annual assessment of English language proficiency. California was well positioned for that. The board had already adopted the ELD standards and designed an assessment that Deb just talked about, the CELT, that's based on those standards for annual assessment. What we had to do then was define goals for progress every single year and then start holding districts or LEAs accountable for meeting the annual measurable achievement objectives. And the two kinds of objectives, again, or AMAOs, are: one, annual increase in the percent of children making progress learning English. So we don't just say how many got reclassified, we say, is everybody moving along at a quick enough clip? Are they making progress in learning English? And the second is, are we having increases in the percent of children who actually attain English proficiency? So those are two important aspects, and it's not the snapshot in time then, as we see with other test results. This is where we're looking at time in program and by cohort. So really something in NCLB that makes a lot of sense. So for that first annual growth target, we define that as in the following: that students should gain 1 proficiency level annually until they reach the proficient level as established by the board, and at least they maintain that level until they're redesignated or reclassified. And that happens in 3 ways. Students at beginning, early intermediate, or intermediate need to gain a level on the CELT from year to year. This is really helpful for us. Remember how we talked about students that might stick at that intermediate level? We want to send a clear message that we need to move kids along, develop their academic reading and writing, whatever it is, to move them along to early advanced levels and so forth. Students that are already...
You know, there are no statistics that we've seen here that show how quickly the kids are moving along, which is really the important part of this whole thing.
Okay, we're expecting, right now we're setting the expectations to be 1 level per year. And we'll still credit districts if the kids move faster than that. We don't want them to stay at any level for more than a year. Well, right now, it depends. Remember, it depends when their initial proficiency level is when they come in. But under this model, we would be looking at students to move through in 4 years, within 4 years. If they move faster, great, they get credit. If they move slower, we want districts to pay attention because that student wouldn't be making the expected progress in that, okay? So students that are already at the proficient level need to bring up all their sub-skills, so listening, speaking, and reading and writing are at intermediate or above. And sometimes students are at the CELT level required for reclassification, but their academics aren't ready for them to be reclassified. So they need to maintain that high level on the CELT in order for us to count annual growth. Now, here are the expectations through 2014 of what percent of the students that we have need to make progress. And the first reports will be out late fall this year because we had to have a data review process. Similar process went into place for establishing what percent of students need to reach proficiency. And we were able to not say what percent of students, like we do reclassification, got reclassified that year out of the beginners and the early intermediates. We got to define a cohort really and say what percent of students out of this group that can reasonably be expected to reach English proficiency, what percent of them attained proficiency last year. And so the cohort is, of course, we need 2 years of CELT data because we need to look at the growth. But students who've been in our schools for 4 or more years, because if we're looking at 1 level per year, that sets us out at the early advanced level. Okay. Any student who was at the intermediate level the prior year or a higher level that did not reach English proficiency, we will include them in that cohort, as well as some of the kids that move a lot faster. If they were below the intermediate level the prior year, but they jump all the way to English proficiency, we'll count them as making progress. So that's another kind of a goal that we have. And we had to set the targets also through 2014. And again, both of the reports for these 2 AMAOs will be out later this fall. And we'll be bringing them to the board for information. So, and that concludes that piece. One final section that we have today is the compliance monitoring for the English learner programs.
Okay.
Is that 4-year program, 4-year time frame for achieving proficiency the same for kindergarten through 3rd grade as it would be for the other grades?
Yes, we're expecting, the 4-year timeline is what we're expecting for students regardless of the grade level when they started. They can move quicker if they have the English schools behind them, and they'll certainly be counted. But it's to move 1 level per year or to bring up all their sub-skills so that they can move to reclassification.
It doesn't make a lot of sense, though. I think that the the kids coming in at the lower school levels are going to start becoming proficient a lot faster than the ones that come in at a higher level.
When you talk about proficiency, we're looking at listening, speaking, reading, writing at the state board's defined level of proficiency of early advanced overall with no sub-skills below intermediate. And when we did the analyses, it did not make sense to look at 2 levels of growth per year. We just didn't have that many kids that were making it. Now, they may move faster through the beginning and early intermediate levels, which I think is what you're talking about, but the growth may slow down over time. So since we don't have vertical scaling or a common scale yet on the CELT, we couldn't set the scaled scores, and we had to look at the overall proficiency levels. And the data just didn't show that kids moved a whole lot faster than that as a group. Okay? So
Okay,
I'll turn
is
it
that
over
it?
then.
All right, thank you. And we need to break quite quickly. So we have a long agenda today, and last but not least, it is Lori Burnham, and I apologize for the short presentation you must make, but we really do have to move along. 5 minutes or less, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, I thought that might happen, and I'll try to do as quickly as I can.
I'm sorry
but,
about that.
Yeah, I knew. I sort of thought that could happen. Understand. Okay, state monitoring. Let's see. Okay, yeah. We just, first of all, want to say that, yes, the state does monitor state and federal legal requirements for services for English learners. And yes, even though it has changed over the years and continues to change, it's always the intent to do so in ways that support both student academic achievement and also district improvement efforts. So we do that on a regular and consistent basis, and I want to get to tell you just in a very few minutes. I don't actually know which parts of this to tell you about, but I'll try to tell you. I'll try to talk fast. First of all, as Jan's already talked about the laws that govern services for English learners, there's the important requirement for districts that they must ensure that students both acquire English and learn grade level academics. There's also a requirement supported by a number of laws that there must be meaningful access to for parents. And the focus of the state's approach is to view these obligations as a shared obligation, an obligation that the state shares with local districts to ensure that students receive the services that they are entitled to. The districts to provide those services, the state to monitor and to support districts. Now, and this is, I think, probably the most important single part. All monitoring, all state monitoring for English learners begins with 2 essential questions. Those are, first of all, how are English learners doing? How well are they acquiring both English language proficiency and grade level academic content? And secondly, how do you know? What evidence supports that conclusion? That's how all monitoring begins. And the goal of CDE's monitoring effort is to help districts answer those questions in ways that are meaningful for English learners. And I had thought of, and a way to try to illustrate this for you, I actually gave this a lot of thought. I'll try to say just real quickly about it.
That is, before we leave on monitoring, I want to invite you to go along with us. The first thing that we do is take a look at the achievement data that's available for students. We look at the AYP, we look at the API, AMAOs, and CST-ELA. I think you understand, hopefully, all of those acronyms. And let's say we're going to a district that enrolls a significant number of English learners. Well, we look at that data, but we know that for English learners, that data doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't paint the complete picture. So when we get to the districts on site, we actually look at the CST, but we look at not just what the scores are for English learners, but as Mr. Hastings points out, we include the former English learners in the cohort. We ask them what it looks like for that entire group. We also ask for the data over time. We want to know what it looks like for students who have been in the program a short time, a long time. That's very important to be considered. We also want to know what retention data and special education placement is for English learners. That's other important data to look at when we're evaluating the effectiveness of the program for English learners. And finally, additional student achievement data. And with this additional analysis, we can get a much better picture. Now, I won't go, I would love to go over these, and maybe we'll get another chance. I'll just kind of zip through. I will tell you without telling what they are that we have identified some keys for successful monitoring based on our work, and I would love to comment on each of those, but I know that we can't.
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Sure.
It's helpful that you've given us the slides in advance so that we can, maybe you can go through it, we can ask questions. The slide ago, you had the goal of compliance is, academic results.
Yes.
That's quite a shift over the last 4 years from where the compliance office used to be. Compliance office used to be, are you implementing these programs, in a checklist-oriented manner? So my question is that real, or is that, and there's been quite a shift, which would be great, or is that what we aspire to do, but in practice, the way it's operationalized is, a checklist of do you have these programs implemented?
I can't comment on compliance monitoring in general. I can tell you that these have been the essential questions as long as I've been here, which has been 8 years at the Department of Education. And I know that we have somebody from Lake Elsinore on the board, and I think she could attest to that that's been a guiding principle, and I see she's saying yes, in the monitoring work that we've done with that district that's been very successful.
So no big shift over the last 4 years. I shouldn't read into that. You've been here 8 years. It's continuing to get better, but it's
the major
consistent
point.
with the past.
What's gotten better is there's more state data available now, and so our work is focused more on let's look at that data and bring the additional data we need to make it meaningful for English learners. So,
and just a point of information, I've had the opportunity to work with Lori over the years, and I think a lot of work has gone on. You've seen the change from comité to no comité. That's a huge difference in how they approach English learner monitoring. And I think that Marcia Bedwell deserves a lot of credit, along with Lori, in making quite a few changes to fine-tuning the output monitoring that goes on. So I think that there have been some wonderful revisions to the program.
It's an ongoing, living situation because we're always trying to make it better. And even though I would love to comment on these and know that I really did prepare a lot of good things for you guys. Maybe another time we'll have time. But I did want to share with you, I'll just conclude with this. We listen a lot to the voices of our students when we're in the field. We also, in terms of modifying and constantly, as Ray points out, working to improve our monitoring system, we listen to the voices of district superintendents. And we've actually started a whole collection, true stories from the monitoring files. And I share just a couple because this does impact how we continue to modify our work. And so, actually, you can read these. I won't even read them for you. The concluding thought, well, first of all, I want to acknowledge, because some of our staff are here, if you guys would just wave. I asked them to come down because I thought I was going to do something really brilliant for them to see. But unfortunately, time didn't allow. We knew that could happen. However, the point that I really want to leave with you is that this is what compliance monitoring is all about, what these superintendents have identified. It's about improving services and therefore results for English learners. And that's what makes a difference for their schooling and their lives. And that's why it's so important. So I'm sorry we didn't have more time to chat with you about it. Would love to at another time, but that's
Well,
very quick.
Lori, I really appreciate you condensing your presentation. Thank you. You're a good sport about it. And I want to thank everyone for all their hard work. It's an excellent presentation, and I know you worked a long time on it, and we really do appreciate it. This will be an ongoing conversation, and we continue to learn a lot more about this. So with that, I'd like to take a...
We have a speaker on this.
Oh, see, I know everybody wants a break very quickly. I'm so sorry. Okay. And Deborah, is this the only speaker, or do we have more? Okay, thank you very much. Sorry about that.
Okay. Martha Zaragoza Diaz, representing the Californians Together Coalition, and good morning. Just a couple of points. I do appreciate the comprehensive review that was given by CDE staff. I thought they did touch upon quite a few